You can go ahead.
Welcome to the State Historical Society of Iowa and our Iowa Stories lecture series. We're honored today to host two distinguished historians who have worked with the Iowa Labor Collection that's housed here at the State Historical Society. If you're not aware of it, since the nation's bicentennial in 1976, we began a partnership with the Iowa Federation of Labor and the University of Iowa Labor Center and the History Department to collect oral histories relating to the experiences of Iowa workers. This is a magnificent collection that has received lots of federal grant money and has now been digitized and is available online for researchers to use. And so today we're celebrating the Labor Day in America, but we're also celebrating our Iowa Labor Collection. And I want to mention that having Professor Stromquist here is definitely an honor for us, because back in 1995, he took a look at these oral histories along with Merle Davis, one of the oral historians who created the interviews. And Professor Stromquist created a book called Solidarity and Survival, an Oral History of Iowa Labor in the 20th Century, which is really our window into understanding workers in Iowa and the role they played in developing our state. He is a seasoned historian who taught at the University of Iowa. He has a new book coming out called Claiming the City, A Global History of Workers' Fight for Municipal Socialism, which will be coming out next fall from Verso Press. John McKerley specializes in U.S. labor and working class history and works as a historian and educator at the University of Iowa. He's quite an expert on oral history, has conducted many interviews himself with some of the recent immigrant workers that have come to Iowa. He has worked with the Labor Collection to develop a Speaking of Work podcast, which can be found if you look at the website for the Iowa Labor History Society, and their website is iowalaborhistory.org. I want to compliment John because he's bringing all of these stories out into the public eye and enlightening us about what it is about Iowa that makes labor history very distinctive and the role we played on a national stage. There's this Speaking of Work was originally part of an exhibit the University of Iowa toured around the state, and there's a traveling exhibit that is available if people would like to borrow it. Both of these gentlemen have PhDs in history. John serves as the president of the Iowa Labor History Society, and Professor Stromquist continues to help us amplify the voices that are collected in these oral histories. If you have questions during our lecture, we ask that you enter them into the chat box, and then Allison will read them at the end of our lecture. We ask you to keep your audio on mute. And we will end this by saying we invite you to our next Iowa Stories lecture, which will be on Wednesday, September 29th. So join me in welcoming Professor Stromquist and John McKerley, and let's explore this rich history of Iowa labor history and Labor Day celebrations in our state. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mary. That was a wonderful introduction, and thanks to all of you who are joining us for this pre-Labor Day celebration. It's an opportunity for us to think about and reflect on the origins of this holiday and what it means. But before doing that, I'd like to just say a few words of remembrance for Rich Trumka, the president of the American Federation of Labor, who died quite suddenly and unexpectedly in early August. He has been one of the labor movement's most prominent and important leaders in recent decades, and one of its greatest lights. He was extraordinarily eloquent in defending labor solidarity and fighting racism, in supporting immigration reform, and had a deep and abiding commitment to the struggle of for workers' rights under these most challenging conditions. It's a terrible loss. He worked in the coal mines himself. He was the president of the United Mine Workers of America at the age of 33. He boldly led the Pittston strike in the late 80s to success. And after serving as Secretary Treasurer of the AFL-CIO starting in 1995, he became president in 2009. John Wilhelm, who is an old friend and retired president of Unite Here, has remembered the key role that Rich Trumka played in building solidarity for casino workers during their repeated strikes in Las Vegas. As John said, the frontier, quote, the frontier casino strikers adopted the slogan of the Pittston strikers, "One day longer." Rich inspired the strikers and the entire union membership again and again, giving all of us confidence that we could win. He believed in his soul that all people are created equal. Solidarity was not an abstraction for him, perhaps because of his roots in the mine and in the mines and the United Mine Workers. So it's a big loss, and I think it's particularly fitting as we approach Labor Day that we keep him and his family very much in our thoughts. So we want to talk today a bit about Labor Day and what we're celebrating and why we are doing so and how it came about. And in particular, we've used the phrase "a celebration from below" as a kind of way of thinking about the roots of the holiday, but also its meaning. So I would suggest that we look back to the context of the 19th century. And I'd like to offer a series of brief snapshots that suggest some of the roots that this holiday had. There are deep traditions of public demonstration and display in which labor sought to claim a holiday and public space and recognition. It took many forms over the years, and I want to touch on a few. But most obviously, it was about workers' claims for respite and rest from the arduous hours and often dreary tasks that they had to do to make a living. It was also, in addition to being linked to the demand for shorter hours, for the 10-hour day originally, and then later the 8-hour day, it was also an affirmation of the centrality of labor to this society. The phrase "labor creates all wealth" was one that was very commonly used in the 19th century by workers and their leaders. And it's an assertion that labor has dignity and that it deserves respect. And that's why these celebrations often, almost always, took place in a very public setting. But the roots, I think, go back, I would suggest, to even the era of the American Revolution, when artisans and workers had played a pivotal role in the agitation for independence. That role, in a sense, carried over into the post-revolutionary celebrations of the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Just as one case in point, there was a very important demonstration on July 23rd, 1788 in New York City, in which labor and artisan workers paraded through the streets of New York. It's estimated that maybe 5,000 to 6,000 workers were in the line of march. And what were they doing? They were celebrating the ratification of the Constitution, but they were also laying claim to their importance to that revolutionary process, but also to the ongoing life of society and its well-being. And so, for instance, various trades marching together in this line of procession would carry the emblems of their crafts or the products of their labor. In one case, for example, blacksmiths and sailors and ship joiners carried with them a model frigate that symbolized the product of their labor. And their banner said, "This federal ship will our commerce revive, and merchants and shipwrights and joiners shall thrive." So this notion that through this pooled labor, the wider society might in fact thrive. The journeyman tailors carried a banner that said, "Adam and Eve, and they did fig leaves sew together." The coopers riding a float that carried them constructed a huge barrel as a symbol of their productivity. And printers operated printing presses on floats as they proceeded through the streets of New York, in which they turned out celebratory odes to the revolution and to workers' rights that were then distributed to the public. So this is an example of workers asserting themselves and their place in society in a very public and festive way. If I jump ahead then, and again, these are kind of snapshots to 1835, there was in Philadelphia a very important general strike for the 10-hour day. At that time, 10 hours was thought to be the optimal working day, which included an hour for dinner and for breakfast. And this flyer that you see on your screen was one that these workers distributed, laying claim to a shorter working day. And again, it took the form of a kind of evolving parade through the streets of Philadelphia. They were not invisible. They were very publicly visible, in fact. And as they paraded, starting with the Schuylkill docks and dock workers, they were joined by shoemakers, they were joined by other tradesmen, carpenters, and assorted other blacksmiths, plumbers, printers, cigar workers, and eventually spread out to the textile mills in the outer suburbs of Philadelphia. It's estimated that perhaps as many as 20,000 workers were in this line of parade. It was a festive holiday kind of atmosphere. It was a strike, but it had the trappings of a celebration. And indeed, at least in the short run, workers in Philadelphia across many trades were able to win the 10-hour day as a product of their efforts. I want to jump now to the immediate post-Civil War period, because it was in that period that labor again took up the demand for shorter hours, but now the focus in a very different economy and a growing industrialization period of industrialization, the focus became 8 hours. And the slogan that was typically used in those demands was 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, and 8 hours for what we will. That notion that we should have time in our lives to cultivate our higher sensibilities and to claim our responsibilities as citizens of the Republic. They were often juxtaposing the notion of free labor, which would be carried out on the 8-hour principle, to slave labor, which of course had just been abolished as a result of a bitter and brutal civil war. The notion that the fight for chattel slavery, the fight against chattel slavery, had its counterpart in the fight to end wage slavery, which was a commonly used phrase, was embodied in their demands. One of the leading figures of that post-Civil War period was a man named William Sylvis. And Sylvis was an iron molder, became the president not only of his union, but of the National Labor Union. And in 1867, he gave an important speech to the conference, the annual convention of the National Labor Union. And his language was very indicative of the kind of vision and perspective that workers had for themselves and the kind of demand that they were making on society. He said, combination or union among working men may be looked upon as the first step toward competence and independence. He argued for machinery, science, and immigration being bound to augment the wealth of the nation, and that working men had a, quote, right to a voice in fixing their share of increase. And then finally, in his peroration, so to speak, in this talk, he emphasized that no one but the working classes could free themselves. It is not what is done for people, he said, it is what people do for themselves that acts upon their character and their condition. And Sylvis and his contemporaries fought very hard for the 8-hour day. They tried to get states to pass legislation that would that would enshrine the 8-hour day as a legal working day. And they did get laws passed in a number of states, but these almost always included a nullifying clause in which the implementation of the 8-hour day was dependent on the agreement of the concerned parties, which of course meant employers and employees. And almost universally, employers failed to live up to their end of the bargain. And so in the late 1860s and early 70s, a series of mass strikes, massive mobilizations for the 8-hour day, and parades on behalf of them took place in New York City, in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania mines, in Boston, Fall River, New Bedford, a whole host of cities. But one of the most dramatic moments in the 19th century came with the massive railroad strikes of 1877, and what was effectively an urban revolt embraced by a wide spectrum of workers from not just the railroads, but across trades and industries. And it was a result of deeply felt grievances having to do with the successive wage cuts that workers had had to endure during the Depression of the 1870s. And one of the more dramatic moments in this strike, and there were many, because the strike swept across the country from one city to another, but one of the more dramatic moments was in St. Louis, in the general strike for better wages and for shorter hours, as part of this broader demand by railroad workers and others for recognition. And what that general strike did was effectively to shut down the city for a period of several days. But it was also an assertion by workers and their supporters that they had a right to control public space and that they had the power ultimately to govern, and that they could do so better than the powers that were. The railroad strikes of 1877 did lead to some improvements, but not universally so. But it was really then in the 1880s, with the return of prosperity after the long depression of the 1870s, that a new energy favoring organization and favoring, again, the assertion of labor's rights to recognition in public space, that kind of set the stage, if you will, for what would ultimately be the claim for a Labor Day. The Knights of Labor were, of course, the pivotal organization in this period, embracing at its peak maybe as many as 750,000 workers across the country. Iowa, for instance, had literally hundreds of local assemblies of the Knights of Labor in one town after another, not just big cities, but in small towns as well, and across many trades. The message of the Knights was that we are all one, and that an injury to one is the concern of all, as the iconography on the screen suggests. I think it's useful for us to try to imagine the way in which workers mobilized in public space in this period, because it was in many ways quite different from, and quite without an analogy in our own time. One of the moments that I uncovered in my own research was in Pittsburgh in the summer of 1882, when a broad coalition of workers organized a massive grand labor parade, as they called it. And as many as 30,000 workers poured into the streets from all of the adjacent industrial towns. Miners came in on special trains from the mines surrounding Pittsburgh, and they really undertook a celebration of their trades and of their vision for American society. Their parade was profusely decorated with literally hundreds of banners proclaiming such things as "Labor is the creator of all capital," "We are building wisely and well," and "No dissension in our ranks." Um, Others carried a huge transparency, a four-sided transparency, if you can visualize it, that said, railroad monopoly manages our steam highways. Land monopoly is stealing our free land. Bank monopoly manages our money. Monopolies are trying to manage labor. All monopolies must die, or the republic will fail. Again, they're carrying this message forward in a very public setting, and they're doing so with a spirit of celebration. They had bands and drum corps and glee clubs in their midst. They tended to march with their trades, holding the symbols of their work and affirming the dignity of their labor. Let me then jump. I'll come back in a moment, and I don't want to use too much of our time here, but I'll come back in a moment to talk about the great general strike for the 8-hour day in 1886. But let me say that another kind of development was emerging out of what would come to be known as the American Federation of Labor, but its earliest formation was something called the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions. It included members of the Knights of Labor, or locals of the Knights of Labor, but also the trade unions in a variety of trades. And in New York, the Central Labor Union, which was the umbrella body for these trades, pushed for claiming a special day as a labor holiday that would be celebrated every year. And P.J. McGuire, who was the fiery president of the Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners, argued that a festive day for a parade through the streets should be set aside, and that it should be the first Monday of September in 1882. Indeed, that occurred, and indeed, it was both festive and huge. Some 30,000 workers marching up Fifth Avenue to Union Square occupied the streets of New York for that celebration. John, you might jump to the next slide. Oh, sorry, that's not. I'm thinking of the Labor Day parade slide. Yeah, there we go. There we go. So that was 1882. In 1883, again, making claim to the idea that this should be a national holiday and it should occur every year. In 1883, about 10,000 workers turned out in New York, and the slogan behind that they put forward was, "We must crush monopolies lest they crush us." In 1884, the New York Central Labor Union put out a call for other cities to join in these demonstrations, and that there, quote, should be no distinction of color. Race prejudice will be ignored. Religious differences will be set aside, but all men will be on an equal footing and in providing for their daily bread. They envisioned a broad and universal movement that would include literally all workers. Buffalo, Cincinnati, Lynn and Haverhill, Massachusetts, and New York, of course, responded to this call, and in 1884 carried forward this demonstration. The Minneapolis Trades and Labor Assembly put out a call that essentially turned the holiday into a strike. It said, "Leave your benches, leave your shops, and claim this right unilaterally." So the holiday evolved. The first truly national observance came in 1885, when many more cities turned out for the holiday, and in the first official sanction of the holiday came at the state level in Oregon in 1887. It was not until 1894 that a national holiday bill was put before Congress by the still fledgling AFL, and indeed a congressman from New York, A.J. Cameron, who was a member of the Typographical Union, was the presenter of that piece of legislation to Congress. It was adopted by Congress on June 28, 1894, And Grover Cleveland, who was president at the time, signed it the next day. Ironically, this is the same Grover Cleveland who, in those very same days, was calling his attorney general to get injunctions to suppress the Pullman strike that was going on not only in Chicago but across much of the West. It's interesting to think about what this suggests about the origins of the official national holiday, and what meaning does it have for a state to sanction that holiday, as it also is laying claim to the right to suppress workers' organizations and strikes. The fundamental point I think that I would make is that labor claimed and secured a day of recognition itself, and that state recognition followed, but it followed labor's very public claims for itself. And just to conclude my part of this, I wanted to just acknowledge that there is another Labor Day that happens to be May 1st, and we sometimes refer to it as May Day. It came to be a day with a history that in fact resonates around the world. But we often don't recognize that its origins, although much more practiced now these days in other countries and hugely practiced in other countries, that its origins really lay in the United States. It began here. And it began in the context of the call for a general strike for the 8-hour day, as I mentioned before, in 1886. Again, going back to the demand for shorter hours that was so central to labor's claims throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th century. Workers had lost confidence that legislation alone could achieve results. And so with the massive growth of the Knights of Labor and trade unionism, they put out a call for a general strike on May 1st, 1886, to demand that workers across industries and trades be granted the 8-hour day from their employers. It's estimated that maybe 350,000 workers participated, and that as many as 12,000 workplaces were shut down as a result of this strike. But it was in Chicago that the most massive outpouring occurred, and it occurred in the context of a strike against McCormick Harvester, where several workers had been killed by company police and city police. And this kind of jumps back to an earlier slide. They called for a mass mobilization in the streets in support of the 8-hour day, but also in protest over the killing of workers in this strike by McCormick Harvester. And in the context of that strike, the very famous, now infamous Haymarket bombing occurred, in which a number of policemen, Chicago policemen, lost their lives, and in which a number of workers, estimated that 10, 12, maybe even 20, were shot and killed by the Chicago police. So this kind of turbulence, if you will, set back the labor movement, certainly in Chicago, for a period of time. But it was not long after that the American Federation of Labor seized again on the notion of May 1st as a pivotal holiday for demanding the 8-hour day. And indeed, the call went out for a general strike of carpenters and joiners on May 1st, 1890, to carry forward the demand for the 8-hour day. And the idea was that each year, another trade or industry would be subject to a general strike, as it was won from one industry to another. Indeed, the carpenters were quite successful in gaining the 8-hour day as a result of their strike on May 1st, 1890. The next year, it was going to be the coal miners' turn. And at the very last minute, believing that the conditions didn't warrant it, the leadership of the AFL called off the strike. Unfortunately, the Iowa coal miners, and there were many Iowa coal miners in that era, didn't get the message in a timely way and went out. They were the only state of strikers to go on strike and were brutally crushed in what was nevertheless a heroic strike. But May Day was fast becoming a labor holiday in its own right, and would continue to be recognized by American workers, but more so by workers around the world, particularly once the official Labor Day was instituted. It was not, by the way, until 1938, with the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act, that the 8-hour day was enshrined in law, and that above 8 hours, overtime was required. But that was a long battle, and there were continuing struggles in the 20th century before the Great Depression, before that that was achieved. So the celebration of Labor Day has changed and evolved over time. It's ebbed and flowed. There have been points where workers upheld this long tradition of claiming public space and parading and asserting their rights in a very public way. There have also been times when Labor Day became a more private, and I wouldn't say quiescent, but an internal kind of celebration within the labor movement itself. So it's taken varied forms. It has varied traditions from one community to another, but it's often included a mix of celebration and protest, and most importantly, in public. So let me pass the ball, so to speak, to John, who has some very interesting material to share with us about, among other things, the way in which the celebration of Labor Day in Iowa evolved.
Thank you, Shel. So as Shel says, what I'm going to do is pick up the story and move us into the 20th century, but with a particular focus on Iowa. So and again, the themes are going to be similar, right? In the sense that we're going to be talking a lot about the way in which Labor Day concentrates these connections between public protest, between politics, broadly defined, between art, right, and creative expression on the part of workers to create a very expansive definition of democracy from the bottom up. So we'll start with that public recognition of Labor Day in Iowa. So, as Shel said, these Labor Day in the United States starts with these local celebrations that take place all across the country, and especially in the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century, and that's happening here in Iowa too. And it's not until 1909 when the state catches up and decides that it might be in their best interests in order to publicly recognize this. So I'm going to read you here. This is the proclamation, a little bit from the proclamation issued by then Iowa Governor Beryl F. Carroll. I believe that's how his first name is pronounced, Beryl, who was a Republican. Again, Iowa, like a lot of Midwestern states, any states that had come out of the Civil War on the Union side, often had very strong Republican traditions rooted in that experience of the war. But U.S. politics, Iowa politics as well, those two major political parties, the Republican and the Democratic Party, were very factionalized and had what we might today call conservative as well as progressive wings, and they existed in a kind of ecosystem, political ecosystem that also included things like the Socialist Party and various other kinds of reform parties. And so there was, in many cases, especially in urban areas, tremendous political competition. And so what that meant is that if you, as the labor movement did, could organize even small numbers of people, that could give you tremendous political leverage. And so what that meant is that the development of again, a progressive wing within the Republican Party here in Iowa that depending upon your point of view, you could say was chasing labor votes, or that had itself imbibed some of these principles. So again, with that as background, let me read you here the proclamation from Governor Carroll. The General Assembly of Iowa did, in its 23rd session, set aside the first Monday of September of each recurring year as a holiday to be known as Labor Day and to be observed by the people of Iowa as a day dedicated to those who, as wage earners, have contributed much to the wealth of the state. The setting aside of this day was not by accident. It was through a recognition of the modern struggle which the industrial classes have waged for their own betterment, as appreciation of the fact that free government depends in a great measure upon the general well-being of the wage earners of the Commonwealth, and a thankfulness over the rapid adjustment between the different interests in our industrial life. Iowa has reason to pay homage to this great majority of our people who work for wages and for industrial and civil progress, right? Again, imagine those themes, right? This is the governor of Iowa recognizing that workers themselves have laid claim to recognition, right? And that they themselves, that their own actions contribute to, as he said, individual and civil progress. So again, that sets the stage there in 1909, in the early part of the 20th century. So we're going to fast forward a little bit here to 1947. So a lot's happened between 1909 and 1947. In particular, as Shell suggested, a little thing called the Great Depression, and it's in that period when you see when you see this crisis, this incredible economic and political and social crisis that has these shockwaves sent all around the country and in Iowa as well, in which you see the labor movement, which had some successes and some struggles, especially around the period of World War I, but that in the 1920s had been sort of back on its heels a bit because of the return of a very aggressive anti-union movement within big business, to seize upon the opening of the Great Depression to organize the unorganized, as they would say, and this was again happening all across the country and including in Iowa. But you were having again these general strikes in places, all around the country: Minneapolis, San Francisco, Toledo, and what this did was it contributed to major political shifts in which the federal government in the Roosevelt administration, again, after some fits and starts and sort of, again, depending upon your interpretation, whether or not they sort of seized upon this this mobilization, or if they came to the, came depending upon how you decide that they came to the game. They do ultimately address this, especially in 1935 with what becomes the National Labor Relations Act. And again, that law, for all of its flaws, transforms the legal landscape for the labor movement, and especially for the industrial labor movement, in which you have now workers with a really solid legal foundation, again, although one that they themselves have to assert oftentimes through strike action, in order to lay claim to legal legitimacy and to project their power both in the workplace and in politics. And so again, if I were to show you what's called the percent of union density, that's the percent of workers that were members of unions, there would be this sharp line up in the middle of the 1930s that follows upon both this self-organization of workers and this change in the legal context that really does fundamentally transform American society. So that follows through what becomes World War II, and but on the after the war, that group of anti-union forces that had developed for a long time in the United States, but that had been dethroned, perhaps the most accurate word, in the late 1920s. It comes back with full force in the period after World War II. And in particular, there's an alliance between anti-union forces within the Republican Party. Remember those conservative Republicans, Northern Republicans, and conservative Democrats, especially in the South, that creates this new conservative coalition around especially anti-communism after World War II. Here in Iowa, well, and actually let me back up and say that conservative coalition passes very significant changes to the National Labor Relations Act, something called the Taft-Hartley Act, that places severe limits on the gains that labor had been able to make legally in the 1930s. And but again, the labor movement does not take that line down, and instead organizes against it. One of the things that law did, the Taft-Hartley law of the late 1940s, is that it permits states to ban the closed shop. So that is, again, to ban labor unions requiring union membership to work in a workplace. And the way that this gets, well, actually, again, I apologize. Let me, often when I teach this, I teach it using a map. And so I'm thinking in terms of my map, which has, again, the spread of these first, again, so-called right to work laws across the South, but also across the central Midwest. So again, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, right? So again, this is a low wage strategy being put forth here by Iowa employers, just as was happening in the former Confederate South at the same time. So again, Iowa workers organize against this. And in fact, they draw on this idea of a holiday, and they declare in April of 1947 a labor holiday in which as many perhaps as 50,000 Iowa workers descended upon the Capitol there in Des Moines in order to make a powerful public protest at the time that this law was being debated in the Capitol. And so here's just a quick bit from a Mason City packing house worker named George Ashlock, how he described this. So when this right to work law come up in the Senate down in Des Moines, we got word of it from our state federation. They notified us up here when it was coming on the floor. We called a holiday at the packing house. We met with the superintendent and told him we wanted a holiday. We was going down to protest this right to work law. There was no argument, because under our contract, we had a right to do that. Anytime we felt that we needed a holiday for any labor thing, all we had to do was to notify 24 hours in advance so that we could arrange the work schedule, right? So again, workers have built this tradition into their contracts, which they have been able to win in these years in the 30s and the 40s. In which they deploy again here in the struggles of the 1940s, late 1940s. And I'll stop that story there, and perhaps people will want to ask a question about that later. So one more example of this that comes again from ILHOP, this collection that was started by oral history collection that was started by the Iowa labor movement, not by historians, to record the memories of Iowa workers. Because again, like as they recognized, if you worked in a packing house all day, you probably didn't have time to write your memoirs. And but your life was important, and your memories were important, and your struggles were important. And if someone was going to remember those things in the long term, again, someone had to do that work in order to make sure that those remembrances were possible. And that's what the Iowa labor movement and the Iowa Federation of Labor in particular set about doing in the 1970s. So another one of these stories that was recorded by ILHOP in the early 1980s was one by another person, another worker, a plumber named Paul Larson, who also worked as an organizer for the AFL-CIO and was based out of Waterloo, but again worked across north central Iowa. And here's a little story that he told to an interviewer. Again, this is about an organizing campaign. One little anecdote, he said, I remember when we organized the Fisher plant in Marshalltown. When I was down there working on that organizing campaign, I was by myself, and it was late winter. The Marshalltown Police Department had been assigned to follow me. So they followed me all my house calls. Every house call I went to, the prowl car with the very obvious insignia on it parked right behind me, watching me on every call I went. Naturally, the people you were calling on, you were trying to convince them of your philosophy and so forth, that did detract a little bit from your ability. You were the type of individual that needed to be watched. Well, we won that, as I told you, but 10 years later, on the anniversary, the union's anniversary, they had a 10-year anniversary party. I was invited and I went down there, and this time they had a parade from the Union Hall down to the Coliseum downtown, where they were having a big party. In the parade, I rode in the front vehicle with the president of the UAW, and in front of us was a police car leading the way of the parade. And I said, well, there was one difference in 10 years. 10 years ago, that bastard was behind me. So again, you see, right, that there's this close connection between protests, between workers asserting their rights in the workplace and in public space, and celebration, and this complicated tension between the two, in which those celebrations are sometimes celebrations, and sometimes they are, again, manifestations of that, of workers' ability to seize power in public space. So let me end with just a few words, and then I'm actually going to pass it off to another one of these Iowa workers whose stories we have. And so what I want to suggest to you again is the importance of thinking about Labor Day as every day. And what I mean that in two senses. So every day in the sense that that Labor Day shouldn't be confined just to 1 or even 2 days a year, that when we really think about what it means, what underlies the concept, it's really something that happens every day, because the struggles of working people are ongoing every day. And at the same time, we should be thinking about it as something that we integrate into our own conception of democracy. Quite frankly, remembering that connection between the need to assert one's rights at work and this expansive definition of democracy that's embedded in the living labor movement. And we see that, we can hear that quite powerfly in this, in these words by a packing house worker from Ottumwa, who was engaged in another one of these strikes in the 1980s that was centered around Austin, Minnesota. And so what we're going to hear is Carl Bales tell us about this traveling procession that he was part of, that went from Ottumwa to Austin, and a poem that he wrote along the way.
A lot of people from Ottumwa down here took up collections and bought food for the Austin, Minnesota labor people who was out of work themselves. So we went up there in force. There was many cars and many trucks, pickup trucks with food, and to take up to those people. And the line as we drove into Austin was quite staggering. People, waving the flags and giving us applause as we drove into Austin, Minnesota, and to the Union Hall. They knew we was coming, so they gave us a wonderful reception to go up there. When I was at the Union Hall in Austin, I said a poem. It's a little gibberish that I made up as I drove to Austin, Minnesota in my car. The reason I made it up was going way back when people was working for pennies a day in coal mines. Women was working basically sweatshops for pennies a day. Kids was working, they had kids working for pennies a day. And I felt that those pennies a day they was making, but the people who ran the businesses was making dollars. And all those people had no way of fighting back. They had to accept those pennies because pennies bought a little something. But they was not treated justifiably in my thinking. Now I'm talking about the time, I guess, in the 1800s and maybe even the 1900s. But after a while, even those people had kind of, you might say, had enough. And I think that they got together with people and they organized and what they called maybe was a union. Unionization. They had to have it. They was getting hurt with no help at all. There was no medical for a lot of them people. Now, I'm talking about way before our time. So I think they got together and they wrote a book. And I think that book was a union book. They had to have something. And they realized they couldn't keep going that way. So companies then had to listen just a little bit. So with that book, it helped them. Well, when I got to Austin, Minnesota, I'd made up a little poem as I drove from Ottumwa, Iowa to Austin. And they asked me to come up on stage, not to tell the poem, but they wanted me and some of the guys to come up on stage and say hi to all the people that was out there looking at us and applauding us for bringing food. So I made up a little poem, and I had all the people join hands. They didn't know what was coming, but here's what I said. I joined hands with people up on the stage, and I told them, I said, I made up a little poem coming up the road, and it's a reference to that book that was written years ago to help people. I said, we do not need more corporate greed, political liars, cheats, or thieves. So now's the time, through a forest we must climb, we've got to shake some leaves. And when they fall down to the ground in total shock and utter dismay, let it be a lesson to the next ones. They better change their ways. And through new eyes, let them realize we're taking on a brand new look. For across this land, joined hand in hand, we're going to rewrite the book. I made that poem in reference to the problems that Austin was having and we was having in Ottumwa, and that's when I made that little poem. And it might be kind of corny, but I got to admit, I got a pretty good round of applause and a lot of thank yous.
Thank you very much.
Well, I just to reiterate the point that John made so powerfully, and that is that labor's public presence can't be segregated to a specific day. And its traditions of collective action can't be narrowed and diluted in ways that diminish its meaning. The point, I think, is to reclaim that tradition and reinvent and reshape it to fit labor's needs and identity today. And I hope that goes forward in communities all across Iowa and all across the country. That we come to recognize our own history and to use that history to go forward even more powerfully than we have in the past.
All right, thank you very much. That was excellent. I'm going to go through a couple questions now. If anybody has any more questions, you can write them in the chat box. Let's see here, I'm changing my view. So far, the first question I had, why can't places like Walmart organize nationwide instead of having to do one plant at a time, or has that changed in the past, or is that a result of different laws now?
You want to?
You go ahead, John, if you want.
Oh, so remember that so the National Labor Relations Act. So remember when the National Labor Relations Act was drafted in the 1930s. It was drafted at a time when the economy was increasingly dominated by these large factories, right? So if you could have tremendous power if you could organize the thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of workers who worked in, say, a giant Ford plant in Detroit. And so rather than sectoral bargaining, which is what you're describing, the labor law was organized in a way that was plant specific. And again, there's a great debate that is going on, that's been going on for a long time and has been going on now about how about how U.S. labor law needs to shift in new directions to provide workers with the kind of new leverage they need in especially in a post-industrial economy.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. So the next question is, what is the fate of the Labor Education Center at the University of Iowa and across the nation at other universities?
Okay, all right. I guess that's for me. So I work. So I work. My day job is at the University of Iowa Labor Center. That's where ILHOP is based, and my colleagues there do fantastic and great work, traveling all across the state and sometimes outside in order to connect Iowa workers in particular with the Regents system. We're the only part of the Regents system that does that work, and we've been doing it since 1951. But several years ago there were budget cuts that severely affected our budget, and that we're still struggling to rectify. And we remain very hopeful that with the changes here at the university and potentially across the state, that we can get back to a sustainable budget model. And so again, we look forward to it's we're chugging along and we're doing great work every day, but it's absolutely true that we always need allies trying to get ourselves back to a sustainable budget model.
Okay.
Yeah, let me just add quickly that labor education centers, in many ways, were a byproduct of this upsurge in unionization that John was describing in the 1930s and 40s, and they're absolutely vital to the health of the labor movement in states across the country. But they've come under attack, not just in Iowa but elsewhere, precisely because that's the role they play, and that's the power they can convey. So it's really important for the public to enlist in defense of these very important institutions. Universities spend a lot of money educating businessmen, but it's time for them to commit the resources to provide workers with the same opportunities.
Sure.
And
okay, this question's for you, Shel. I was interested in the manifesto, which mentioned no racial or religious prejudice. To what extent were these sentiments widespread in other strikes? Also, were women included?
Well, it's an important question. The labor movement, in a lot of ways, is a kind of prism for wider society, and so it would certainly not be correct to say that the labor movement has not had at times a race problem or a gender problem. It's intention with this impulse to wider solidarity. And it's a struggle that goes on from decade to decade. There have certainly been moments, as that quote alluded to, when the labor movement has overcome the prejudices of the wider society. But it also is the case that in many ways it's been a constant struggle. To the extent that workers of color and women have been able to organize, they have become an important voice in the labor movement itself, and help to themselves to reshape the culture of unions and the culture of the labor movement. And indeed, Rich Trumka's successor, Liz Schuler, is the first woman president of the American Federation of Labor and the AFL-CIO. So there's progress, but it's always a struggle, I think.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So probably maybe the last one I'll do is, has the labor movement pushed back against the movement to robotics? PBS has a new series on the future of work, and it is chilling. Someone's comment. So what would you say about that, if you have any ideas?
Go for it, Shell, because I think this takes us back to Silvis.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's, you know, there's an old labor song, the refrain of which is that every generation's got to do it again. You know, capitalism and industrial capitalism in particular has been a constantly evolving form of economy, and workers have had to adapt constantly to those changes. I mean, back in the period that I was talking about, and John also mentioned, the AFL, you know, at one point in its history became very entrenched in a kind of narrow form of craft unionism that really put boundaries on other workers. And it was only very gradually that, and really with the advent of the CIO in the 1930s, that some of those barriers got broken down, and that new workers who were, quote, less skilled could enjoy the benefits of organization. That's simplifying the story way too much. But
Sure.
But in any case, I guess what I would say is that we're indeed in the throes of a reshaping of work and of the economy in ways that we can't foresee. And you know, the impact of the pandemic is only the tip of the iceberg in many ways. But
Yeah.
It's going to be incumbent upon the labor movement to find ways to adapt and to reach out to and organize new workers who suddenly find themselves subject to kind of employer control in ways that they might not have in the past. So it's a continual struggle to kind of reinvent the labor movement to meet the needs and the demands of the time. But it's done a great job over time.
Allison, can I add a quick
Sure.
follow up to that? What I would say too is that the labor movement isn't necessarily anti-technology. The fundamental question that the labor movement raises about that is who owns the robots? Who owns the technology? Who gets to decide how it's used and where the gains of productivity get placed? Do they get placed in workers' hands, right? Do workers have a say in how that technology is implemented? And again, who benefits? Do all the productivity gains, as has happened in the last 50 years at the very least, gone just to the very small people, the very wealthy people who control those robots and who have been using them to amass great wealth and to lay off a lot of people? Or should they be used to truly improve the lives of workers and give us some more of that time for what we will?
Right.
That's such a good point.
Robotics could mean shorter working hours, but workers need to be compensated and can't begin to live off of the the crumbs that would be left to them if they didn't have a claim to some of that productivity. Yeah.
Wow, that's such a good point. Okay, John, before we go, could you just give people a really quick overview of how they could use the ILHOP, or what's the best way for people to look at the ILHOP, or how do they even start? Oh, I think you're muted.
That's a great question. So there's two major ways. So ILHOP is a great big partnership, and two of the critical parts of that partnership are the State Historical Society of Iowa, which has generously sponsored this program, and the University of Iowa Libraries. So two ways to get to ILHOP. One is the physical way, which is to go to the State Historical Society where the physical materials are held, and you can put your hands on transcripts, and you can access the collection that way, but you can also access it now online through the University of Iowa's digital library. So Yeah. So if you go to the digital library, you can search for ILHOP, and you can listen to the interviews and read transcripts.
Awesome. Thank you, John. And Hang has put the link down in the chat. So if anybody's still not sure how to find that, otherwise you can, like John said, you can just come in and talk to us librarians about how to get there. I just want to wish everybody a happy Labor Day, and thank you so much to John and Shell. This was excellent. So round of applause virtually. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.